Kate Milafalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It is time for our Saturday book, and we are continuing our epic journey through The Real Marilyn Monroe by Larry Jordan. A beautiful picture. Subtitled Debunking the Myths and Revealing Intimate New Details of Her Life and Death. I try to keep a couple of videos ahead, you know, the holidays and everything. It's getting very good. Stick around. It's really interesting. We are on chapter 26. Her last year begins. So there was a gossip column, and there were always gossip columns, and if they didn't have something, they made something up. Pretty interesting. We wouldn't know anything about that. So, in the gossip column, it said Marilyn Monroe is right to hold out for a good script for Something's Gotta Give. So, trying to remember where I left off making a video and where I left off actually reading about it. So, have to move back a little farther in time and remember what you guys know. Something's got to give. The script was problematic. It wasn't completed. It was debated. Marilyn felt it did not meet the standards it needed to meet. Important to remember, she signed a contract in 1955 that gave her approval over the director, the casting, the script, just everything you can think of. So she had a lot of power in this movie making thing, which I think has a lot to do with what ended up happening to her. Anyway, the screenwriter, Nunnally Johnson, familiar, famous screenwriter's name, he was hired to revise the bad script for the movie, and this was in response to Marilyn's dissatisfactions with previous versions. There had been many that had been submitted to her. This is a modern remake of the 1940 screwball comedy starring Cary Grant and Irene Dunne called My Favorite Wife. Great movie. Nunnally and Marilyn had worked together in How to Marry a Millionaire, and he had been critical of her. But in preparation for this movie, they had very fruitful discussions, and he revised his opinion of the actress and now thought her astute, witty, and someone who possessed a sixth sense. And I think this is a theme that runs through many comments that people make about her. She had an intuitive understanding. She had a sixth sense. She was psychic. So interestingly, they talk about how the money was split up. First of all, he recalled their first script conference, and this is a quote: "We met in a New York cocktail bar. I got there 15 minutes early, and she was already there. She's just as likely to be too early as to be too late." And she actually said something about this to a reporter close to the time of her death, and I thought it was really an interesting comment that she made, so keep that in the back of your mind. Nunnally Johnson described one evening he spent going over script ideas with her as one of the most enchanting 3 hours I ever spent. He got paid $125,000, and she, the star and partial owner because of her production company, got $100,000. So that just sort of puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? She had more money in the bank, but like as much as $250,000, which in those days was about $2 million. But she borrowed money from Joe, and she borrowed money from the City National Bank of Beverly Hills to put a down payment on the house that she bought. And there's a reason for that, which will become apparent. She continued to pay and kept her small apartment in Manhattan, but she regarded New York as her true home. She really never felt fully at home in Hollywood. Dr. Greenson talked her into buying this particular house in Brentwood because it was near him, and it was a good substitute for having a baby and a husband, he told her. She paid $57,000 for it, which today would be upwards of $587,217. It was a 2,300 square foot hacienda style. These houses are ubiquitous, especially in Southern California, and they're lovely. They have a sort of a kind of a, not Moroccan, but a Spanish kind of sort of adobe plasterish red tile, curved archways instead of doorways, decorative Mexican tile. They're really beautiful, and they have a feeling of tranquility about them. It sounds like almost like they're a movie set, you know, that they're done in a style, but there's something very cozy and relaxing about that particular style, and Marilyn tuned right into that. It was close to the Brentwood Country Club, which I don't think she really cared about. And when she signed the contract to buy the house, she cried. And she cried and she told them, "I never thought I would be doing this all alone." At the door, there is a motto. And I don't know if it's right in the adobe plaster stuff or if it's on a tile, but it says "Cursum Perficio," which is Latin, and it means "I complete the course." In other words, my journey is over. When I go across the threshold, I'm home. I guess this is actually pretty popular in a lot of places to have that on the door. She made trips to Mexico, which we'll hear about, to buy furnishings for it, in keeping with the style of the house itself. The attorney, Rudin, got her to hire a new secretary, Sherry Redmond, but Marilyn wouldn't even let her in the house. She felt very protective of this house. She had her just go to the office type of thing. She didn't like her, instinctively didn't like her, because her name was Sherry, and Sherry was the name of Marilyn Monroe's character in the movie Bus Stop. But also because the secretary was kind of a little bit OCD and wanted Marilyn to get all of her finances straightened out and in great order. And it was a big mess because that's not how her brain worked. She told somebody that this woman can't be one of my good friends. But the secretary actually served great purpose. She was very organized and she was astute, and she discovered that people were overcharging Marilyn. Marilyn was not good at business. The secretary was. And for example, Eunice Murray wanted Marilyn to sign blank checks over to her. She could just, write for any amount she wanted. And Redmond said, "No, you come with receipts, you'll get money." She started to think that Marilyn's accountant, Julius Winokur, was embezzling from her. But eventually, she investigated this and eventually found that it was actually the New York attorney, Aaron Frosch. He was a friend of the Strasburgs, and he was the one who drafted her will. And after she died, there was a major lawsuit against Frosch for improprieties in the documentation. The Strasburgs were sneaky. They bought a studio in Los Angeles and they got a TV special in LA, and they never told Marilyn after all the advocacy she did to get them to move or expand from New York into Los Angeles. In January of '62, she was invited to a small party that included one of the guests was the poet, Carl Sandburg, and she knew his poetry, and they spent a lovely time sitting alone talking about literature, and there are photographs of that. Carl said she spoke well. It was really good to know her off the stage. Jordan, the author here, describes a letter that came from Ann Landers to the wardrobe mistress. They knew each other, I guess, and they spoke very highly of Marilyn Monroe. The crews loved her. The people she worked with, the hairdressers, the makeup artists, the seamstresses, the ordinary people working backstage on whatever sets and everything, they all loved her. She was nice to every single person. February 1st of 62, she had dinner with the Lawfords and the AG. Now, if you remember, I'm being circumspect about names here because of obvious current events. So the AG, that's the title, not his name initials. That's his title. Younger brother of POTUS at the time. So figure that one out. The Lawfords were there. The AG was there. Ethel was there. And so was Marilyn. And she sort of considered it, jokingly referred to it as a first date with the AG. But she knew him already. She was sort of planting the seed of, oh, how nice to meet you. You know, this is such an honor. They knew each other already. Greenson was sneaky and manipulative. So here's an example of what he did. He gave his son a list of questions and told him, memorize these questions, and just casually, the next time you're talking to Marilyn, ask her about this stuff. And they were political, foreign policy questions. They were picking her brain. She was being used as a spy for the Comintern, and this was the communist organization that he belonged to and was a big shot in. She was unaware of this. People are clear that she was really completely unaware of it. It was presented to her as a young teenage kid, kind of picking her brain. And I don't know, I guess it just didn't occur to her, wait a minute. The AG asked her at this party, who's the most handsome person in the room? At the party, he called the dad, Old Joe, as opposed to Joe the baseball player, called the dad Old Joe to brag and to say hello to Marilyn. They went out of the room where the party was going on alone together into the den and shut the door for quite a time for a talk. Jean Martin, this is Dean Martin's wife at the time, told of told about a friend of hers who encountered the AG at a party, and he locked her in the library of the house with him and threw her on a couch, and Ethel was in the other room. These two brothers did what they wanted with women, and the wives looked the other way. That was expected. But there was a period of time, the author talks about Ethel being particularly prolific, productive. But there was a period of time where she wasn't, during the time between 1959 and 1963, and that overlapped with the time when Marilyn was most prominent in these relationships. And so rumor had it that there was a falling out between husband and wife, like a Cold War. Marilyn was worldly wise. This whole thing was for her an ego boost, and she never thought that he would ever leave his wife for her. She didn't want to be married. She didn't want to be married to him. She didn't want him to leave his wife for her. She wasn't pining away for true love. She was aware that this was a fling. It might have been titillating, long-term, off and on, giving the appearance maybe of some sort of long-term connection, but it wasn't like that. She asked him the questions that the doctor had presented to his son. She asked him, and his response to her was, have you been attending some kind of meetings? He knew that she was under surveillance. And was he suspicious, or did he actually know that these questions were planted with her? He didn't answer them. The older brother retaliated when he was challenged about his girlfriends. For example, he had a research assistant that belonged to McGeorge Bundy. Well, she didn't belong to him. She was his research assistant. McGeorge Bundy was the head of the NSA. And McGeorge Bundy urged him to, this would be Jack, urged him to end this affair. And in response, sort of in vengeance, instead, she was given a job in the office. So she was always around. Marilyn was smitten with the general, the AG, with calls and visits and him sneaking around with her when he was in Los Angeles. And there's just an overwhelming amount of documentation and evidence. Lots and lots and lots of people who not only didn't have anything to gain by telling the truth about this, but may have actually been putting themselves at a certain amount of personal risk. And the narrative is really consistent. This did happen. This was going on. In 1962, the mafia bosses had a meeting in Miami to decide what to do about the general because he was going after organized crime. He announced it on the air and let it be known that he was coming after them. She tried to get her friend Ralph Roberts to come to LA during this filming that they were doing. They were best friends. They were very close, and he helped to ground her and made her feel a certain amount of security that she could lean on. Wasn't, a friendly ear. It was hard to find people who cared. There were people who kissed up, but she needed people who cared. So he said that she would refer to Jack as the gentleman caller. And she told Ralph that she was getting to be friends with Patricia Lawford, the sister. Peter, okay, so this is several Peters. I had to think about this a minute. Peter, Patricia's husband, the actor, he said that he and Pat have been friends with her since 1949. So there's a lie there someplace because they weren't even together until 1954. So there's some, were his dates shaky? Was that intentionally wrong? Was it supposed to be misleading? But I think the real kernel of useful information here is she knew all these people way back in the 40s. Why was she being so friendly with Patricia now? That just seemed odd. So this is one of the reasons why she might not have been. You would have expected her not to have been. Pat had dated Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy, who had tormented Miller. The AG was at the time, the assistant counsel to McCarthy. And so he was an assistant during the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings that blacklisted people. He was a bulldog for McCarthy. And he actually was so close that he made McCarthy godfather to his first child. He had been a guest at Hyannis, McCarthy had, and he had attended a couple of different family weddings. And one of the little tidbits of gossip that came out of these connections, people who knew them, people who saw them, was that Patricia had a bottle of wine every morning for breakfast. So there were a couple of movies being pushed by members of the family. There was PT 109 being pushed by Jack, and then there was The Enemy Within being pushed by the AG, and there was a disagreement about how often did she see either of them or both of them? But there's a ton of eyewitness testimony that she did, when and where. Sometimes is disputed, but there's no dispute that this was ongoing with all of them for quite a while. For example, there was a note to Marilyn from Jean Smith. She's another sister. And in this note, one of the lines was, "You and Bobby are a new item, we've heard. We the family." In 2016, this letter sold at auction for $28,000. In 1994, Jean denied it. And she didn't deny that she wrote the letter, per se. She denied that she was implying that there was an affair going on. But there was this very open attitude within that family, even in the women of the family, that boys will be boys. Boys will play, girls will pray. The AG was adulterous. He was often characterized as a Puritan in the media. And I was telling Nate earlier today, he was very sad that Paul Watson's history is mixed, troubled. He's got some troubling character things going on. And we were talking about having idols that often had feet of clay. It's best to understand that nobody is perfect and all of us have flaws, and even the most admirable person who does fabulous things has been responsible for bad things and poor choices as well. And it was really hard for me, I was telling him, to read all these details. I'd heard rumors, but I hadn't paid a lot of attention. And this book is so well documented, it's very difficult to argue. You might argue with one of the eyewitnesses. You might argue with 3 of the eyewitnesses. But when there's just dozens of people who've seen the same thing, it's really hard to deny. So he was not the Puritan that the press characterized him to be. That was a persona. The way that Marilyn had the Marilyn persona and the jovial husband / doting father that you saw in the Oval Office. And then the Attorney General was so uptight and moral. It was all a big subterfuge. There's a 1956 KGB file, and this is documented. This has been revealed by Freedom of Information, that he asked for a woman to be sent to his room when he arrived in Moscow on a visit in the 50s. And here's this will cure you of a lot of delusions. In 1967, Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, caught the AG in bed with Salinger's wife. And then there's this little tidbit. Asked if it was true that Marilyn was having affairs with both brothers at different times, the press agent, Michael Salzman, said of course she was, and everyone knew it, but in those days the press had a different relationship with celebrities, both in show business and in politics. I usually gave reporters inside stuff on other clients to assuage their desire to publish something about Marilyn and the brothers. The next door neighbor to the Lawfords said that there were many, many, many rendezvous there. The official car used to drive up, and you knew the AG was in town, and that help would come in and say, Marilyn just arrived. During one conversation, Patricia made reference to, very casually, look what Ethel's going through. Wow. Other eyewitnesses were neighbors, Fox maids, janitors and maids for the stars at Fox Studios. Marilyn complained to the AG that Hoover, the FBI guy, was spying on her. And he told her that they wanted to get rid of Hoover, but they couldn't. Why not? We'll find out. this makes me sad. This is one of those things that I found really hard to listen to, but I don't discredit it. The AG was a severe homophobe. He did not like Hoover for that reason. Hoover got wind of the fact that the AG was getting ready to fire him, and he paid a visit with his dossier, his nice thick file dossier, to the White House. And he was there for much longer than he was supposed to have been. And when he left, he kept his job until he died in 1972. I'm just saying. In 2018, classified files on the assassination were released, and the discovery was made that, yeah, the FBI was spying on her. But also, a guy called Fred Otash, a private eye, was spying on the brothers and their family for Jimmy Hoffa, who was involved with the mob. It's like a movie. And the AG was going after Hoffa because of his association with the mob. And this private eye Otash was hired by many in Los Angeles. In fact, he's the guy who inspired the character that Jack Nicholson played in the movie Chinatown. If you haven't seen that movie, it's an older movie. I would really recommend it. It's one of those outstanding movies. And it's based on true stories. It's about the water wars in early California. Well, early 20th century California. Otash was who Lana Turner called the night that her boyfriend was stabbed to death in her house. And suspicion now exists that Otash, this is allegedly, helped to cook up the story that the 14-year-old daughter Cheryl did it because she was a minor. And that the implication being that Lana did it, and that they decided to sacrifice this little girl to get Lana off the hook. And taking it another step forward, there was speculation that Lana caught this boyfriend doing what he shouldn't have been doing. And with, I can't say, but, draw your own conclusions. The Beverly Hills police chief himself was convinced that Otash staged the scene. This guy made a fortune on divorces, and there's a lot of detail about that in this book, and I'm not going to go into it right now, because if I went into all the detail, we would be here until 4th of July. So anyway, he made a fortune on divorces because this is before no-fault divorce, and he took pictures of cheating spouses to take into court. He also sold any gossip that he taped because he did wiretaps. And gave photos to Confidential magazine, which was just a gigantic rag gossip mongering thing. In 1957, he did an interview with Mike Wallace, and Otash admitted that he would do anything for money except commit murder or work for a communist. Wallace stated bluntly that Fred Otash was the most amoral man he had ever interviewed. And then Jordan says, Mr. Wallace, however, was a conniving, odious man with a gigantic ego who mistreated co-workers and was himself dishonest. Oh boy, am I going to have some questions about this guy. This is for your benefit. Anyway. Otash hated the AG. And in 1959, he was accused of a felony and lost his PI license. And he later described bugging places that he knew the AG and Marilyn would go and bugging their phones. I mean, he did it on purpose because he knew that they would be there. It wasn't to try to get information to prove it. He wanted to have ammunition. Okay, this is a description of the Lawford House in LA. It was built by Louis B. Mayer in 1926. Beautiful, beautiful architecture from that time. That Moorish Spanish style, just beautiful. The house was a 2-story ochre-tiled rotunda, glistening white Spanish Riviera, Style, it had a huge round living room with 15-foot high ceilings and exposed dark beams. There was a full stage under the floorboards that could be made to rise with the push of a button. From Mayer's ownership onward, the house was considered one of the crown jewels of the Gold Coast, a place where the superstars of that era could congregate to enjoy lavish parties. It was located on Pacific Palisades Road, which is actually part of the Pacific Coast Highway now. Beginning in the 20s, family patriarch Joe Kennedy had invested heavily in Hollywood and had even managed 3 studios, so he had long-term relationships with many of the film company's power brokers. These connections proved fruitful when his son ran for office. But Otash said, this is Otash, Hoffa was the mob. You can't be the head of the Teamsters Union unless you're approved by the mob. He said that in the 60s. This is not me saying it, and it's not about today. Okay, when he went to wire up the Lawfords' house, he discovered that it was already bugged. Somebody had beaten him to it. He also bugged Marilyn Monroe's Doheny apartment and her new house, and she was on a 10-day trip to Mexico, so it was very easy to get in and bug her. His partner, Bernie Spindell, was a spy master. He arrested he was arrested 204 times, this guy, for whatever he was up to as a private eye. But he was acquitted 203. Everything Marilyn Monroe did and said was given to the FBI, given to Hoffa. Ignore my dogs. She had no privacy. Unwittingly, she hired Otash herself to tape her phone calls, and those tapes were never found. Why did she want her phone calls taped? Because she was doing a lot of business negotiation with the studio, and I think she felt like maybe she needed a little insurance that people would believe her, that she had this ongoing relationship. Chapter 27, Marilyn is a busy lady. In February of 62, she went to New York City for fun and did an interview for Life magazine. The assistant reporter who showed up at first was drunk and really rude to her. And this is what she said. Oh, my dogs are barking because my husband's walking in the door. This will be over in a second. Sorry. This woman was wasted, and she says to Marilyn in a condescending fashion that she overheard that all the photos that Marilyn didn't approve of would be destroyed, and said, how can you dare to do such a thing? And Marilyn just deflected her by saying, you're giving me a fisheye stare, but I love you anyway. And the guy that was the main reporter, this woman who was drunk was his assistant. The main reporter wrote to Marilyn 2 days later and said, you have all the clearance rights that you want, and, don't sweat it, basically. Those were not his words, but that was the tone. So she met up again with her friend Ralph, and this is in, New York City. She saw Elia Kazan she called him Gage. She had mixed feelings. He was a renowned director, but he had testified to the House Un-American Committee, and he ended the careers of former friends, got them blacklisted, so he was a troubling character. In 1999, he was awarded an honorary Oscar, and dozens of actors did not applaud in the audience, and there were 250 picketers demonstrating outside. Rosemary Clooney, does that ring a bell? This is George's aunt. She was friendly to Marilyn, and if you're not entirely sure who she is, she was in Holiday Inn, White Christmas, with Danny Kaye and Bing Crosby. Is that right? Something like that. That famous Christmas movie where they sing Sisters. No, that might be Vera Allen. Oh, I'm so glad I have such an accurate memory for names. If you enjoyed this, you'll enjoy me trying to figure out what's the differences between Kash Patel and Vivek Ramaswamy. I could not keep them straight. All I know is the guy with the eyes is scary. Anyway, Rosemary Clooney, George's aunt, was friendly to Marilyn. She told a funny story about her infant son and her husband, Miguel Ferrer, and the son, when he was just a baby, he was like just over a year old, was paging through a book, you know, the way babies do. And he kept returning to the photograph of Marilyn Monroe and staring at it. Nancy Sinatra once said that there are 3 people I've met in my life who had an aura, who glowed: Elvis, my dad, and Marilyn. So Marilyn went over Nunnally Johnson's rewrite of Something's Got to Give with Paula Strasberg and didn't like it. And she said, we've got a dog here. This is just no good. Her secretary, Sherry, found that Marilyn was seriously overcharged by a limo company. While she was in New York, they charged her almost $8,500. And what she found out was people like the Strasbergs, they had ordered this limo days before Marilyn even got to New York, and they used it for their own purposes 24/7, and intentionally went on a driving tour of New York, even though they lived in New York. And they had the limo drop them off at Marilyn's apartment, but she wasn't even there yet. It was a subterfuge to make it look like she was paying, you know, she ordered the limo. Marilyn got a letter from Eunice. So there's all this, you know, these letters back and forth that flesh out a narrative. She got a letter from Eunice, who she doesn't like, from her about her new house. Marilyn had put Eunice in charge of overseeing the work being done on it and let her take charge of a lot of decisions. She sounded very bossy, according to these letters. I'm not going to repeat the whole letters. You know, it had to do with carpeting and, you know, the color of paint. And but the costs were crazy. And Marilyn was mistrustful of her, but still let her do the work. And she went to Miami to visit her ex-father-in-law, Isidore. This would be, this was Miller's father. He was shocked to hear that his son, Arthur, was remarrying, getting married to Inga and Morath, and had not even bothered to tell his father that he was getting married. A news article compared Marilyn unfavorably to Miller's new wife, you know, just, you know, bodily descriptions and stuff, and also called Marilyn stupider and less cultured. After her visit with Isidore, she checked into the same hotel as Joe DiMaggio. He escorted her the next day to the Miami airport. Marilyn denied that they were reuniting. She was still having these flings with the 2 brothers. Joe was always trying to get her to leave Hollywood and be his wife, you know, the little woman. And she wasn't interested, but they were close still. And there was a lot of gossip around that. People didn't understand their relationship. Chapter 28, Marilyn is ambushed by communists. So she went to Mexico to get furniture, and her hairdresser was a guy called George Masters, and he remarked how easily and dramatically that she would slip into the Marilyn persona when it suited her. He said she knew how to become what people expected of her in a social setting. It was kind of like a protective bubble, too. He also didn't like Eunice Murray. He said, this is a quote, she was a very weird woman, terrifying, terrifically jealous of Marilyn Monroe. Murray separated Marilyn from her friends. She was a divisive woman. In Mexico, Marilyn found a hotel room that had armed guards and armed guards patrolling the hallways. And she was really freaked out. She wanted a normal hotel room. but quickly found out that it was because there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of unruly fans trying to get into the hotel, wandering the halls, banging on doors, and the armed guards were to protect her. 2 days later, she gave a press conference, and there were 200 people there. She wore a Pucci dress, if that matters to anybody, and she was buried in that dress 6 months later. Her purpose for being in Mexico was to furnish her house. People reached out to her to offer her help with that. Questionable people. She was called the female Charlie Chaplin. Somebody asked her about it, and she says, I consider that a flattering exaggeration. When she was asked about Miller's second marriage, she said, I wish him the best. Hedda Hopper didn't like her, called her the biggest sensation down there since Cortez landed. She was always really snarky about her. But she did give her credit for being what she called the greatest ambassador of goodwill the U.S. government ever sent to Mexico. Unbeknownst to her, unbeknownst to Marilyn, communists were sent by Greenson, and intentionally they found a way to manipulate them into being introduced. And because she was being thrown together with these people, she had no idea who they were, what they were up to. They were friends of her doctor. That's all she knew. The U.S. intelligence was onto them, and that put a target on her with U.S. intelligence, and the CIA started monitoring her. They've been monitoring her since 1955, but now this was red alert, right? Pardon the pun. So the FBI had been monitoring her, the mafia was monitoring her, and now the CIA was monitoring her. In 1974, the CIA director Colby fired an agent called, check this name out, James Jesus Angleton. And given the stories associated with this guy, I wonder about this name. It's a great irony, Jesus, and looks like Angleton. He was doing a massive spying program on American citizens. There were many other CIA abuses that were revealed by the Senate investigations of Senator Frank Church, including use of mind control drugs. And it was called the most shocking spy story in American history. It led to the creation of the House and the Senate intelligence committees to oversee covert operations. During this trip, Eunice introduced Marilyn to her communist ex-brother-in-law, Churchill Murray. He had contacts in the Soviet and Cuban embassies. This is not presumptive. This is actually proven, all these weird connections. She was introduced to a whole lot of subversive expatriates, including Dalton Trumbo and Albert Maltz, who married, it's so confusing, Maltz, who was sort of living in exile in Mexico because of the House Un-American Committee. He married Marilyn's doctor's ex-wife. So she had a Dr. Engelberg. He was the crazy one with the secret library, that guy. Marilyn met Albert Maltz in Mexico. Maltz was persona non grata in LA because of the blacklist. And he was married to Dr. Engelberg's ex-wife. Engelberg had all kinds of weird associations. So there's just this circle of weirdness. U.S. intelligence suspected her because of meeting these people. There's nothing to believe she had any idea what they really were up to. But it confirmed for the government that she was a communist sympathizer, and she was also introduced to Frederick Vanderbilt Field by Greenson. We talked about him before. she was driven to meet him by Churchill Murray. These people were all in cahoots. The Fields were communists. They ingratiated themselves into her life. They offered to help her on a 3-day shopping trip in Mexico. They're all trying to gain her confidence to get information out of her about people in the White House. She was too trusting of the wrong people, but these obvious efforts to cozy up to her did validate that she had somebody's ear in the White House, that they were close because other people wanted to take advantage of it. Later, Field revealed that Marilyn told us of her strong feelings about civil rights, for black equality, as well as her admiration for what was being done in China, her anger at red baiting and McCarthyism, and her hatred of J. Edgar Hoover. She was beautiful beyond measure, warm, attractive, bright, and witty, curious about things, people, and ideas. Also, incredibly complicated. She didn't know about Greenson and Field and their communist connection. She was unaware of that. She told them at talks with the younger brother about talks that she had with him, like pillow talk, about these crazy plans that were in the works, having to do with Cuba, plans having to do with exploding cigars and LSD in spray mist, and false flags that would give excuses for going into Cuba. And this really did confirm that AG knew about the CIA Castro mafia connection. Sorry about the dogs. Oh, they're barking at the vacuum cleaner. I apologize. Susan Strasberg defended Monroe's friendships with these people as totally innocent. She said when she wasn't an expert on a subject, but she wanted to be, she got hold of somebody and picked their brains. And after she'd gone through enough information, she was pretty knowledgeable about whatever it was, and lists all these different topics. She had a library of over 400 books that covered all sorts of topics and all sorts of authors. She was friends with all sorts of authors. When she met Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev during his 59 American tour, they discussed the brothers Karamazov and her dream of playing Grushenka in a film version of the book. She was reading To Kill a Mockingbird at the time of her death. Her library also contained books on gardening, Bibles, children's books, including her very own copy of The Little Engine That Could. The FBI was getting reports from informants who got their information from Eunice. Eunice was a fertile source of information. And she told them that Marilyn had leftist views that Marilyn got from Arthur Miller. What was Eunice doing? Helping to introduce her to communists and then tattling on her. What was going on? Why was she positioned by Greenson in the first place? The subterfuge being deployed by Eunice Murray and the Bureau to monitor Marilyn was summed up in an FBI memo which stated, extreme care should be used in reporting any of this information to avoid disclosure of sources who were associating closely with subjects during her visit to Mexico. I don't know what was going on. We can ask about that. Very confusing. Marilyn really went to Mexico for decor for the house, as you will find out as we go along in this story. That was her primary concern. This is what she was really focused on. She was aggressively pursued when she got there by a 26-year-old guy, Jose Bolaños. He was a confidential informant for the FBI, worked with Eunice Murray and the CIA, and hung out with E. Howard Hunt of Watergate fame. So this is very similar to what happened to Dorothy Kilgallen. If you guys remember, we did the book about Dorothy Kilgallen. She was approached and romanced by a much younger man who was flattering and trying to get close to her in the months before her death. Exact same pattern. He serenaded her one night with 2 mariachi bands. Oddly, Pat Newcomb, the PR person, later had him escort Marilyn to the Golden Globes that happened in March. Was he trying for more information? It wasn't a romance. It's absolutely for sure it wasn't a romance. Frederick Field, who was into stuff himself, warned Marilyn to not trust Jose Bolaños and described him as a man of left-wing pretensions, deeply distrusted by the real left. Somehow that did not dissuade Marilyn from hanging out with him during the remainder of her Mexican visit. So that was a puzzling connection. Perhaps it was just that she was flattered, hard to say. She told her sister that her hosts were begging her all the time for big donations. She said, quote, they think I'm rich. Everyone is begging me for money. For example, at one point they asked her for money for an orphanage, and she gave them $1,000, and they acted insulted like it wasn't enough money. And she told her sister she was so embarrassed she gave them $10,000. There were many holdups in the delivery of the things that she bought in Mexico, and as a result, her house was getting put in order, and she had these particular objects like wrought metalwork chandeliers and picture frames and stuff, and big empty spots where heavy furniture was going to go, but it kept not coming and kept not coming, and so her house looked partially moved into, which I guess it kind of was because she was waiting for the furniture to arrive. There were delays. After her death, the cops came in and said, oh, well, this proves she'd given up on life and didn't care about her house. That was the opposite. She was really anxious. And there's record of that. She was always on the phone and writing letters and asking people who she knew in Mexico to intercede to get the work done. She was just waiting for this delayed delivery. So there's a gross mischaracterization of her house and her attitude and her mental state and her living situation. To get out of trouble for the fact that he was overprescribing Nembutal, this is after her death, Engelberg claimed that she actually bought a bunch of Nembutal in Mexico. This is not true. This could be proven to be not true. While she was in Mexico, she slept better than she had in years and took no sleeping pills at all. It's stress, right? She got nasty letters complaining from her property management in New York. And she put two and two together, and this is what happened. Field's wife, this is this millionaire guy related to the Vanderbilts, who's also a communist activist. He and his wife were going to New York, and Marilyn said, why don't you stay in my apartment? So she gave him the key, and they went to the apartment, and Marilyn got a nasty letter from the property management. There's riffraff hanging around, and she right away wrote back and said, I can only assume that this is because his wife is Mexican. Kilgallen wrote that Marilyn was not a bit upset about Miller getting remarried. Having been questioned about it, she just seemed disinterested. She couldn't have cared less. She certainly wasn't shattered. She certainly wasn't depressed. She was just, I think, bored by the question. Eunice Murray stayed in Mexico after Marilyn came back home. She stayed a few days in Mexico, and the question has always been, maybe she was dealing with the furniture, but was she also being debriefed? She sent information to the FBI to give to Hoover, so we know that that's a fact. She told them that Marilyn is very vulnerable now because of her rejection by Arthur Miller and Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra. She telephoned Sinatra to come and comfort her, but he would not do it. Eunice said that Marilyn feels like a negated sex symbol, which is all baloney. Sinatra helped her arrange the trip to Mexico and then went on a dinner date when she got back. So it's just nonsense. She left Miller. He didn't leave her. She left him. And Joe was the one who wanted to reunite with Marilyn. He was always pestering her to get back together. And she had a vacation in Mexico because Sinatra helped to arrange it. And when she got back, they had dinner together. And No, not when she got back. When he got back from his tour, they had dinner together, and they planned at that dinner they were going to make 2 movies together. So these characterizations of her are all really untrue. Also, Eunice makes a mistake about referring to her psychiatrist. She doesn't call him Greenson. She calls him Wexley. Well, there was a Wexley eventually, but at this moment, not. What was that all about? Eunice then said that Wexler had hired her and paid her, but this wasn't true. She was hired directly by Marilyn and paid directly by her. Why was Eunice deliberately creating 100% false narratives that Marilyn was unwell, depressed, lovesick? What was she laying the groundwork for? In 1955, Marilyn was selected to be a model for one of the 10 famous Americans in a cultural exchange with Russia. And she applied for a visa. So when this happened in 1955, she wasn't going for politics. She wasn't going for any ideology. It was a publicity, hands across the water, arts and crafts type of stuff. She really wanted to go to Russia because she wanted to get a firsthand look at Russian theater. So when she returned from Mexico, Dr. Engelberg, the freak, gave her injections for 3 days. And the question has always been, what was this guy pumping into her? This is really troubling. His ex-wife may have revealed what it was. Let's take a look at this. Not only did the ex-wife allude to her in her divorce petition in 1962 that her physician husband had given her shots containing barbiturates and hypnotic drugs to control her, but that he kept Marilyn sedated for Dr. Greenson. Between the 2 doctors, Marilyn was receiving Nembutal, Seconal, phenobarbital, and chlorohydrate, a potentially lethal cocktail, a very lethal cocktail. Greenson had also increased her dose of sleeping pills on March 3rd, 1962, when she got back from Mexico. All of this was unusual because Marilyn was in a great mood after her trip, reinvigorated for plans for remodeling and furnishing her new home and making new movies. So why were they medicating her? Greenson had administered sodium pentothal to soldiers in his previous work. And it makes people suggestible, and the patient won't have a memory of what they said when they were suggestible. They would talk and then not remember. Truth serum. Were these therapy sessions and drugs to pick her brain, find out what she knew about her association with people in D.C.? But she did continue a healthy lifestyle. She had a very strict diet and very strict exercise. She was like a health nut, kind of, much more so than you would think for the time period. So that's the end of this video. I will be back. This is the end of number 9. And we'll be back with the beginning of number 10 here in a minute. The plot thickens. This is getting more and more intrigue happening. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you're enjoying it. Slungafoil.